it's Alexis with Project Management Made Simple. In this video, I'm going to answer the question, what are the advantages and disadvantages of Agile and Waterfall projects? So first, taking a look at the advantages of using the Agile project management methodology. First, we have the increased business value. When we're working in Agile projects, we are focused on building those requirements that have the most business value. And this is something that we uncover and that we discuss further. If we're using the Scrum Agile framework, then this is something we will discuss in sprint planning, also something that we will discuss in grooming as well. And so there's a higher likelihood that we're going to have increased business value when we use the Agile framework. Now, another benefit, another advantage of using Agile is going to be getting immediate feedback, because we're working with customers on a daily basis and we are aiming to have consistent demos where we're showing them what is being built on a consistent basis. Then we're going to have the ability to receive immediate feedback. Versus if we're working on waterfall projects, those types of projects are going to be built in phases. So we have all of our requirements gathering up front, we have all of our development, all of our testing, and then finally our deployment if we're talking about a software project, for instance. And so with something like that, that means that we are going to be building all of our requirements at once without getting any feedback until we get into the testing stages of things. And so there's going to be increased risk with not having that feedback immediately. If we're using the Agile methodology, however, we are able to overcome those risks by being able to receive feedback immediately. Another advantage is that we're able to detect and to fix issues faster because we are building and we are testing at the same time, typically in a sprint cycle. Again, if we're looking at the Scrum Agile framework, then we are able to detect issues a lot faster because we have both our developers and our QA team working in tandem to not only build the software, build whatever it is that you're building, but also having your QA, your quality assurance team, who's then validating that what is being built is actually what is expected and to uncover any issues that need to be resolved. Now let's get into some disadvantages. I would also argue that these could be potentially considerations. So if you are someone who's looking at, should I use Agile? Should I use Waterfall? Think of these disadvantages as considerations. So first is documentation. I worked with a team where my team was given an app that was built by another team, but then had to be maintained by my team. And the biggest issue that we ran into with this was there was no documentation. So the developers that were building the app built it, but didn't document anything. So we didn't necessarily know how anything worked. Now the developers are able to reverse engineer, right? They can go through the code and better understand it, but it would have been helpful to have some documentation. And this is something that can be a disadvantage of Agile because there is less of an emphasis on documentation. There's not necessarily this thought process that there should be no documentation, but because there's less of an emphasis on it, when you don't have documentation, there's always the risk that if this is an app that is built but then maintained by another team, or that particular developer who built the piece of the code is not present, is not available, well then it's going to be a lot harder to make, or could be a lot harder to make fixes or to make changes to the code without having an understanding of what's actually been built and having seen that in some type of documentation. Another disadvantage that comes with using the Agile methodology is measuring progress. If you are someone who's working in a typical corporate environment, then you as the project manager, as the Scrum Master, perhaps as the product manager, are going to have to roll up status to executives. And so the concept of Agile and how we measure progress can be something that is very hard, if not impossible, for some executives to overcome without having a lot of training and a lot of kind of mindset shifting. Their typical way of measuring progress I've seen is percent completes. And percent completes are based on the notion of having an understanding of what the entire scope is of something, which is the complete opposite thinking of Agile. In Agile, we do not have fixed scope. So how do you have those conversations with your executives that you've actually made progress when progress is working software, right? Agile thinks of progress as working software. And so being able to have those sorts of conversations and actually prove and show that the team is building something and how much is remaining is a conversation that is dependent on the organization, and it's also dependent on the executives' buy-in to this agile way of thinking. Another disadvantage or consideration is that you need to have a dedicated team. When we're talking about agile, we are talking about having a dedicated team of developers, of QA, of business analysts, of multiple people. And yes, typically in the Scrum world, we're talking about prescribed roles of a product manager, the development team, and the Scrum Master. But in the real world, we're going to have multiple folks who are attributing and contributing and being a part of that team, and it is best to have a dedicated team. But realistically, we're not going to have a dedicated team. We're going to see developers who are working on multiple projects. And how this affects us in Agile is that we now have a velocity that can sometimes be skewed. We don't necessarily have a consistent capacity. We have team members who are splitting their focus between different projects, and we all know that multitasking is very inefficient. So this way of, if we're truly moving towards the agile way of things, ideally we would have a dedicated team, but in the real world, that becomes something that's costly, right? We're not necessarily going to see organizations that are hiring a developer that's going to work on one product or one project. They are going to be required to split their time so that in the organization's mind, they can optimize their resources. And so this is something to consider when we are thinking about applying the agile methodology, is that it works best when we have a dedicated team. To add onto the part of the dedicated team, it's also important to have a dedicated customer. So whereas before Agile became big and we're working on software projects and the customer just gave a load of, maybe requirements that they had and said, okay, development team, go off and build this. The Agile framework really requires the customer to be involved on almost a daily basis. And that is something that can be quite challenging for customers because they have another day job, right? This building out this product, or perhaps a project within the product, is not the only thing that they're working on. And so this idea that they're going to be dedicated and be available to you at any given time is not something that I've personally seen in the real world. I'm sure that it's possible in some organizations, but it is a consideration because, again, it requires that shift in the mindset that in order for this team to be effective, in order for the project to be effective, it's going to require a lot more attention from the customer than if we're using the waterfall methodology. So now let's move into the waterfall advantages and disadvantages. The first advantage that comes to mind for me is going to be that we understand what our scope is. So when we're working on waterfall projects, the assumption is that we know what the scope is. And typically this is why this type of methodology is better suited for projects that are tangible based, things like construction based projects versus intangible projects like software projects. And so if we are working in the waterfall methodology, we will have an understanding of what the full scope is. And so our customer will have an understanding of what they can expect at the end of the project. If we're working with the Agile framework, however, then we don't necessarily have a good understanding of what the scope is going to be like at the end of the project. And this has implications depending on the nature of work that you are doing. So especially when we're talking about agreements and contracts, from my experience, it is very challenging, even if the nature of the project is to build software, it's software implementation. Customers can tend to be more uncomfortable if we don't have all of the scope laid out, right? Because now they're taking on the risk that they have to kind of trust that you as a team are going to build what they want versus having a legally binding document that says all of the scope, says all of what it is that they want to be built. Now, when we're talking about waterfall projects, however, there is that understanding of the entirety of the scope. And so this also makes it easier to have the conversation of how far along are we in the project, right? Because we have an understanding of what the scope is and how much of it that has actually been built so far. Another advantage of this is that there is less customer interaction. And so again, thinking about waterfall projects as tangible based projects, it makes it a lot easier since we have this idea of a lot of planning, or one big planning phase. We've had all of those conversations with our customers. We can now go off and build whatever it is that we're building, and we don't require so much interaction with the customers to be able to get our job done. This is something that is important when we're using the waterfall methodology, because now we don't have to spend time waiting, and waiting is waste, right? If we are having to wait for a customer to get back to us, that can be a lot of wasted time, and time is money. Now, waterfall projects, in contrast with agile projects, do have an emphasis on documentation. Documentation is actually pretty big in the waterfall world of things. And I know that in general, documentation can be boring. Team members don't want to do it. And, ideally, you would kind of slim it down to what is necessary, but it is an advantage to having some type of documentation because, as I mentioned before, if we don't have any documentation, then we run the risk that if that resource is unavailable, if they leave the company, then having to reverse engineer the system can be very costly and sometimes not as effective as having some documentation that can be referred to understanding what exactly has been built. Advantage of waterfall projects is because we don't necessarily have a dedicated team, then we'll be able to optimize those resources such that because we're working in phases, we'll have all of our building happening in one phase. So all of our builders, developers, whoever's actually building the outcome of the project, and then the validators and the testers can then do their work after the building has been completed, versus having to require both sets of resources constantly be available. We are able to shift these resources such that when building is done, we can hand off to the development, we can hand off to the QA team, and the QA team can be working on other projects while they're waiting for this particular build to be completed. So now let's get into some disadvantages, some considerations when it comes to waterfall projects. The first one is that because we are executing our work in phases, if there is something missed in the planning phase, if there's some requirement that we didn't think about, we do need to go all the way back to the requirements. We do need to go back all the way to the planning phase of things before we then execute and bring that requirement through. This can be very inefficient. It can be very costly. This is why, again, we want to think of using this type of methodology for those projects where we can have a good understanding of what the scope is up front, because if we don't, it can be very costly to then have to build out another requirement that didn't come about until we actually got into the project. So another disadvantage, because we're doing the work in phases, is that if we are building software, if we are using the waterfall methodology to build software, for instance, then a disadvantage is going to be when we are building something, because we are not validating until the next phase, there is a high likelihood, a high risk that there are going to be defects that are found, and it's very hard to say how costly those defects could potentially be. But if we're measuring this in terms of time, we want to find defects early and we want to fix them fast. If we are waiting several weeks on end before we actually validate and test a piece of software, then this information is going to be further from that developer's minds because they're going to be working on something else. And so now once it's actually in the hands of QA who's doing their testing, if they're finding any fixes, this could have an implication, or finding any defects, this could have an implication on other features that are perhaps dependent on the feature that was built, and have a trickle down effect of now all these various places where something's not working and something needs to be changed, and now the developer has to go back and make those changes, and they may have to do a lot of changes because, again, with waterfall, we're not doing our testing until a completely separate phase. And so that's something that you want to consider if you are considering having the waterfall and using the waterfall methodology for a software-based project. We also have to consider that because we're not working with our customer on a day-to-day basis, that we don't necessarily get immediate customer feedback. And that can be very risky, because what if we're building the wrong thing, right? What if we are building according to requirements, but requirements don't specify how something should be built? They don't necessarily specify how something should look. And so in that case, if we're not working consistently with our customer and getting their feedback, we could be going down a road where we're building something that is not effective, that is not what they want, and is going to be costly to then have to completely do the rework. finally, and this last point really goes hand in hand with the point that I was just making before, that if we are using the waterfall methodology for a software-based project, there is the chance of gold plating. And gold plating is where we have features that are being built into the solution that have either not been asked for or features that are not even used, right? There's the chance that when we're determining the scope at the onset of the project, that of course the client is going to be asking for everything that they want, right? Because in their mind, this is their only shot to get it. But that can be very costly for them, that when it comes to actually deploying, again, if we're having the software example, that when it comes to actually deploying this project and having it go live and launch, that we then could potentially have features that are not used or are not needed or that make the system overly complex, right? And so that is something else to consider as a potential disadvantage. Again, if we're using this methodology for an intangible type of project like a software-based project. This is a video answering the question, what are the advantages and disadvantages of Agile versus Waterfall? If you enjoyed this video, if it gave you something insightful, please do give this video a thumbs up, and I will talk to you all in my next video.